going to begin with a presentation from Alan Moran, who is Director of the Regulation and Deregulation Unit at the Institute of Public Affairs in Australia. He was formerly with the Australian government and is an expert in regulatory affairs, originally from Manchester. Okay, so we've got another Brit. Anyway, I'm going to hand over to Alan. Hopefully you'll be better able to understand him than you were me.
Thanks, Julian. From a kind of southern accent to a northern English accent. I wanted just to pursue a theme in Mary's started this morning, which is the issue of access to energy against reduced wealth. And I wanted to examine energy consumption, the cost implications of the measures proposed to abate carbon dioxide, and the economic consequences of achieving the abatement targets. Now, we've got very many emission abatement goals that have been floated. Perhaps the two most conservative of these are an emission stabilisation goal and a 20% reduction goal. Australia and in England, the respective Garno and Stern reports have envisaged much deeper cuts than both of these. This first chart shows the growth in terms of business as usual, with emissions in 2030 projected forward at the 1990s to 2004 growth rates. And what it shows is that emissions are an aggregate 43 billion tonnes in 2004, which is about 50% above the level they were in 2004. So 43 billion tonnes in 2030, which is 50% above 2004 levels. Now, even though emissions in the developing world probably overtook those of the OECD in 2007, per capita emissions were very much lower. They were 2.4 tonnes compared to 11.5 tonnes for the OECD and 7.9 tonnes for the former CPEs. Notwithstanding the fast growth of the developing country emissions in business as usual 2030, per capita they remain only about a quarter of the OECD, which is you can see from the aggregate numbers are in the third sort of tiers. One of the real complications and one of the realizations, I think, that's not been said until fairly recently, is that if we are to have some sort of a per capita emission target, it has to be on a per capita basis. They have to be allocated in some way, equally across the world, and per capita is a way to do that. So if we start thinking about what that means, if we're calling for a 20% reduction on a per capita basis, then the average aggregate for the world in 2030 is 2.5 tonnes per capita. And if you compare that, just compare that with what the OECD's 16 billion or 12 tonnes per capita, that becomes quartered on that scenario. And some have argued that there will be gains from the developing world, but as a whole, the developing world won't gain because it's, even though it's committed to increase slightly, it's only a very slight increase and it's miles below what their business as usual would be. In this chart here, the East European is about standard. So there are more massive cuts than people were originally envisaging when we were talking about 20% reductions or stabilisation, whatever. In order to achieve anything meaningful, the OECD group has got to reduce its emission levels by about a quarter of what they presently are. The alternative of doing that is that then that the emissions will migrate. They will migrate then to the developing world, and therefore there will be little, if any, net reduction in carbon dioxide emissions. One of the issues, I think, for the developing world, though, even in this scenario, is that many of them are already reaching or above that 2.5 tonnes per capita, which would have to be to stabilise. China, for example, is up to about 4 tonnes per capita at the present time. So China, which would argue it's only got about a fifth of its people out of poverty, essentially would have to stabilise or reduce its emission levels in this sort of scenario that we're talking about. Others have argued, well, there's plenty of scope to grow trees, and that this can also benefit some of the developing countries, and certainly would improve Indonesia and PNG, one or two others. But basically, trees are a dead end. There is not enough ground to do anything other than a pinprick. Ominously, though, in this kind of scenario, that we've had people in the Ghana report in Australia as one have hinted very strongly about the necessity of trade pressures on developing countries to reinforce their sense of public spirit. That in itself, I think, and I'll come to it, would really destroy the world trading regime and retard all countries' living standards. But the process is in fact already underway with the EU negotiations of bilateral free trade agreements with developing countries, which increasingly link trade policy to climate change. Now, we had a bit of a discussion about reducing carbon dioxide emissions by other forms of fuel, and of course, there's absolutely no question about it. Wind and any other solar is basically a dead end, at least any technology we can think of. But nuclear isn't. Nuclear power is more costly for some countries, like Australia, where we have abundant coal. It's about 30 to 40% more costly. But for many other countries, nuclear power, in many European countries anyway, is cost effective. Now, several countries, though, have already gone down the road to nuclear power. This one is basically to illustrate France. France, compared to the OECD average of about 12 tonnes per capita, France, which is fundamentally nuclear, 70%, does 6 tonnes per capita. Now, the interesting thing is there, of course, that France has gone virtually all the way possible that it can go with displacing carboniferous fuels with nuclear, and basically is still at 6 tonnes. It has to go down to 2.5 tonnes per capita in order to meet the sort of goals we're talking about. It can't do so through nuclear. We know wind is a dead end. How is it possible to do it? And there really aren't any answers to that. And don't forget, many of the countries, the European countries in particular, like France, have already, in a sense, outsourced a great many of their energy-intensive industries to Gulf and Eastern Europe, where there is much cheaper energy. I'm talking about smelting industries, etc., which is pretty strong in Australia. This chart, actually, which just happens to be Australia, but the other countries are pretty much the same, it really just illustrates the impossibility of meeting the emission reductions by replacing coal with nuclear. And in itself, that's the least fearsome solution, I think. But the fact is that electricity is only about 35% of the CO2 equivalent emissions. So if you reduce it all, we don't come anything like to the sorts of levels which we've been talking about to get that per capita, world per capita level of 2.5 tonnes, which again is quartering the existing OECD level. The report of the former Prime Minister in Australia illustrated some of the problems where it did model the effect of a 37% reduction, which would be required to get to the 80% of 2004 levels. And the gap that we can see along the side is 37%. And it said, rather coldly, to illustrate the magnitude involved, this is equivalent to, for example, replacing Australia's entire fossil fuel-fired electricity generation capacity with electricity from nuclear, while at the same time removing all existing vehicles from our roads. In other words, it's just so very difficult to foresee how it can be done. We've got to remember as well that the sort of measures we're talking about aren't occurring in a vacuum. Even the sort of Kyoto recalcitrants, like Australia used to be one, the US still is one, even these countries are undertaking a great many measures which are effectively taxes on conventional energy. For example, we have a massive number of subsidies in Australia for renewable energy technology and installations. We have regulations for what we call 5-star housing, which basically means any new house has to be built to incurring several $1,000s worth of additional expenditures which the house buyer wouldn't normally or wouldn't voluntarily put in, and these are really great measures to reduce carbon emissions because they solve everyone's conscience, but everyone who has a house already, of course, doesn't have to pay too many costs, so it shifts them out to other people, mainly younger, less affluent people. And then, of course, we have obligations on retailers to use a specific growing amount of renewable energy. It's about 20% by 2020, which is effectively about 12% of non-commercial renewable energy. It's possible to bring all these things together and say, well, what is the actual tax effect of all that? And the answer in Australia is about $10 per tonne of CO2, which would add about 30% to the ex-generated cost of electricity. When we first started looking at this, and I've been looking at it since the early 1990s, $10 a tonne was mooted around as a sort of a reasonable sort of price that would do the trick. That would actually resolve our problems. But I think people are more realistic now. Even Stern, it's difficult to find it, but it's buried in there. But he's talking about $100 per tonne, and even that is actually reinforced by a whole lot of things which the economist Lionel Rollins famously referred to as the very scarce commodity human love. That is, persuasion and people wanting to do things because they want to save the world rather than just out of crass commercial forces. So we've seen energy costs are already rising strongly in OECD countries in the light of the self-inflicted measures to reduce the emissions. But the task that's sought by those who want to achieve what their version of avoiding catastrophic human-induced warming would require quite massive disruption, things that we've never even considered before. It would bring an additional loss of income as we are diverted from buying things from countries and all from countries which are low-cost energy sources. And of course, it will retard, probably make impossible the growth of the developing countries. And none of it is possible without the developing countries being part of it. It would simply be transferring the emissions from the developed world to the developing world, given the fact that the developing world is as large now, if not larger than the OECD countries. So what we're likely to see is goods being allocated in some way with a carbon rating, and a tax would need to be imposed on imports without such a rating. In other words, you couldn't simply say, well, we'll rely on people to play fair. Essentially, there will be a tax, there will be a rating on goods and services to actually ensure that the regime is maintained. And at the very least, this will create tensions. The developing countries will maintain that they're being denied the opportunity to reach first world standards. And in addition, developed countries, aside from denying themselves the cheaper goods from the third world, will be incurring inefficient expenditure investments in green energy. This is especially favoured by the Democrats here. And this reduces the overall productivity of investments and therefore income levels over and above any of the very, very considerable transition costs incurred in economic reconstruction.